For the next 31 days on the FCPA Compliance Report, we're going to be bringing you a daily tip, strategy, or idea that you can use to improve your program. Here's your host, Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist.
This month's sponsor of 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance Program is Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent, integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 750 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance programs, visit this month's sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. The Board of Directors Oversight as an internal control. Many compliance practitioners would not see a board of directors as a compliance internal control, yet I think it can be considered one. In the FCPA guidance in the 10 Hallmarks of an Effective Compliance Program, there are two specific references to the obligations of a board of directors in a best practices compliance program. The first is in Hallmark 1, which states, within a business organization, compliance begins with the board of directors and senior executives setting the proper tone for the rest of the company. The second is found under Hallmark number 3, entitled Oversight, Autonomy and Resources, which says the Chief Compliance Officer should have direct access to an organization's governing authority, such as the Board of Directors and committees of the Board of Directors, i.e. the Audit or Compliance Committee. Further, under the U.S. Sentencing Guidelines, a board must exercise reasonable oversight on the effectiveness of a company's compliance program. The Department of Justice prosecution standards pose the following queries. Did the directors exercise independent review of the company's compliance program? And are the directors provided sufficient information to enable them to exercise independent judgment? The DOJ remarks over the years have driven home to me the absolute requirement for board participation in any best practice or even effective compliance program. I believe that a board must not only have a corporate compliance program in place, but must actively oversee that function. Further, if a company's business plan includes a high-risk proposition, there should be additional oversight. In other words, there is an affirmative duty to ask tough questions by boards of directors. But it's more than simply of having a compliance program in place. The board must exercise appropriate oversight of the compliance program and indeed the entire compliance function. In other words, the board has to ask hard questions. It has to be documented. It must be fully informed of the company's compliance strategy going forward. Lawyers often speak to and advise boards on their legal obligations and duties. If a board's oversight is part of effective financial controls under Sarbanes-Oxley, that also includes effective compliance controls. Failure to do either may result in something far worse than bad governance. It may lead directly to an FCPA violation, or it could even form the basis of an independent FCPA violation if the government chose to take it in that direction. A company must have a corporate compliance program in place and must also actively oversee that function. Failure to perform these functions may lead to an independent liability of a board of directors for its failures to perform its allotted task in an effective compliance program. Internal controls work together with company policies and procedures and as an interrelated set of compliance mechanisms. There are 5 internal control concepts around a board or a board's compliance or audit committee overseeing compliance. Number 1, risk assessment. Now, we've thoroughly visited on risk assessments and how this forms one of the key components of a best practices compliance program. But it should have board involvement, and it should have board oversight, and the board should be a part of this, and this should be documented as well. So a board should assess the compliance risk associated with the business of the company. Number 2, corporate compliance program and code of conduct. A board should have overall governance document which will inform the company, its employees, stakeholders, and third parties of the conduct the company expects from these entities, whether they be employees, stakeholders, or third parties. If the company is a global or multinational, this document should be translated to the relevant languages for local organizations. Number 3, implementing procedures. A board should determine if the company has a written set of procedures in place that instructs employees on how to deal on the details of the compliance program. When was the last time your board of directors made this really simple inquiry, yet an important internal control? Number 4, training. There are 2 levels of board training. The first should be that the board has a general understanding of what compliance is, but more, or FCPA compliance is, but it also should understand the role it has in an effective compliance program. You as a compliance practitioner may have to bring in an outside expert to put this training on for the board, but the board has to have training on both. And that's an effective internal control. Finally, number 5, monitor compliance. A board should independently test, assess, and audit to determine if compliance programs and policies are a living and breathing program and not just a check-the-box exercise or a paper tiger. There have been recent FCPA enforcement actions where the Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission discuss the failures of internal controls as a separate basis for FCPA liability. With many of the questions currently raised by the roles of boards of directors in numerous scandals and their failure to act, you might think that this would be an area where the Department of Justice would be ripe and willing to explore. So it could certainly be part of enforcement action for independent board liability. So what are today's 3 key takeaways? As I've continually noted throughout this series on internal controls, that there may be many internal controls which you had not thought of as compliance internal controls. And I think the board's role in compliance certainly falls into that category. The board has to actively oversee management of the compliance function, but every time the board does something, that can act as an internal control. The key is that you document that internal control and that it be, if a gap is determined, that gap be remedied. But the board, in its function, can act as an internal control. Number 2, there's a 5-step process that I outlined for the board or the board's compliance committee. And the board needs to, you as a compliance practitioner need to make sure the board has been involved in all of those. And let's briefly recap. Number 1, risk assessment. 2, corporate compliance policy and code of conduct. Number 3, implementing procedures. 4, training. And then 5, monitoring. You as a compliance practitioner should insist that the board have roles in each of those, and that can act as separate internal control. Finally, with the SEC in particular's emphasis on internal controls, it could well be that they would take a look at the failure of a board to engage in its role in compliance as a violation of an effective compliance internal control. There could be civil liability for this. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for joining me on day 12 of 1 month to more effective internal controls, and I hope you join me tomorrow for day 13. This is Tom Fox again. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of 1 month to better internal controls. If you've listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate this podcast, as it would help in our rankings. Get the word out about the only 1 month podcast series, which enables you to design, implement, and enhance a better compliance program. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will join us again tomorrow. Once again, thanks to our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, for sponsoring this month's series. This production of 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance Program is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you will join me again tomorrow.